Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everybody. I will speak in Bahasa and also English because there is not only participant from Indonesia, but also there is a participant from outside Indonesia, from Malaysia and the other country, and so we will mix between the Bahasa and also the English. So this one is the first ESL Green Talk with the topic of the PES implementation in selected country. And thank you for joining this web seminar. I would like to welcome to our speaker Pak Andre Equeno and Ibu Andita Firsela Utami from the World Bank, and also our moderator Pak Hari Priyadi from the World Bank also. And then welcome to Dean Faculty of Economic and Management, Prof. Dr. Insinyur Nunung Nuriartoro, and Head Department of Resource and Environmental Economic, Dr. Ahyar Ismail, and also the Secretary of Resource and Environmental Economic Department, Ibu Meti. And also all other invited guests and participants from Indonesia and other countries, which I can mention one by one, sure. All of you can see that there's so many participants here. So before we start, I would like to inform some information about this Green Talk. Actually, this Green Talk is at the first is the guest lecture of the forest economic, but it's increased to the public, open for the public, so it's become the Green Talk. And then sure, in this meeting for all other participants, please stay unmute your microphone. Let's permitted by the host or the moderator, so it will be make a situation to good, so don't unmute your microphone. Okay, and then during the presentation, participant can post their question in the commentary column. So you can post your commenter in the commenter column, and then the moderator will arrange question and answer session and choose your question when the discussion session is start. This meeting will be recorded in the Google Meet and also will be streaming live in the YouTube and Google Meet. And then now we are going to the first session. In the first occasion, we will I would like to invite Dean Faculty of Economic and Management, Professor Dr. Insinyur Nunung Nuriantoro, to give a keynote speech about the PES. For Professor Nunung, the time is yours.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Mas Danang, to host this very important webinar. Pak Andre from World Bank, Mbak Afu, nice to see you again, Mbak. And then Pak Hari to moderate and lead this discussion. First of all, I would like to give an appreciation to Departemen of Resource and Environmental Economics, Faculty of Economic and Management, IPB, who organized this very important discussion. I believe that every day we follow many webinars, but those webinars focus on COVID-19. But today, this is also very important, not just only during pandemic, but this is will like forever, talking about environment, talking about economic growth, talking about other problems facing in the world. So today I just want to give an emphasis, and I believe all speakers will discussing more detail concerning on payment for environmental services all around the world. Yeah, I also have to greetings all participants, not just only from Indonesia, I heard, from Malaysia, from Thailand, and from other Southeast Asian countries, and maybe also some other countries in the world. Next, please. Next, please, Mas Dana. Next, yeah. Slide, second slide. Terus ke atas lagi, Yeah. So, payment environmental services in the context of economic development. On the right side, I think it is very familiar to all of us. If we are talking about sustainable development, at least there are three, we call it triangle. concerning on economic development, concerning on environmental objective, and concerning on social objectives. Or most common, we call it people, planet, and people 3P, yeah? People, planet, and profit. But then the question is how we can simultaneously achieve three different objectives between economics, environmental, and social. Because sometimes among three objectives, there are trade-off. If we try to achieve more economic growth, then sometimes we have to sacrifice some environmental area. I just give you a number. The natural disaster in Indonesia from 2006 until 2018, around 18,000 evidence. It's quite huge. This can be because of flood, this can be because of landslide, this can be because of volcanoes and things like that. But the point is that when we try again to push more on economic growth, then the environmental will be degraded. So on the left side, I try to have to categorize. This is based on Constanza, Robert Constanza. I think most of you also know who is Robert Constanza. If we just focus on growth, and then the primary goal just economic growth, but then we should also consider about the ecological economic model, where focus must shift from merely growth to development in the sense of improvement in the quality of life. So this is very important. If we are talking about COVID-19, I believe that the pollution is very, very decreased. So quality of life increased. But this is because of crisis, not because of the pattern of development. Things like, again, another attribute like this distribution or poverty. Yeah. If we just focus on growth, then we are concerned about how sometimes just like lip service. But we have really to implement in the context of ecological economic pattern development. Next, please. Next, Mas Danan. Yeah. Next. So this is really the question how we have to deal between among three different objectives that we can achieve simultaneously. So then the question and the challenge for PES, because PES related to the environment mostly, then environmental is like a public good and externality. So in the context of different political setting, how we can implement PES effectively, how we can then have a good benefit if every country also trying to have a good PES scheme. This is the first one. And the second, if we really want to implement PES, should and who should pay and who should and will pay for the environmental services? Is everyone will pay, or if developed country will pay, and then who actually the actor? And then the last thing that very important, if we want really to implement PES, how is the best program for different countries? Yeah. So in the end, if again we try to connect to link between different perspective, ecosystem as a natural capital, and then the society, there's a landholder or resource manager, and then link between society and landholder or resource management, there will be payment for environmental services. So all these things should benefit from the development, not just only for certain people, but also for all community surrounding the place where PES will be implemented. Last one. Next, Mas. Next, please. So this is the challenge, the three challenges that PES should be considered before we implement it. Even we know, yeah, again, we know that PES actually can be a new window, new source to fund new source of fund to finance environment and economic development. If the national development trying to reduce poverty, how then can PES linking with the poverty reduction? If the PES will be linked to unemployment, to reducing unemployment, how the best scheme for reducing unemployment? Yeah, things like that. Reducing poverty and then equality is also part of the important thing. Actually, environmental services by theory is a set of biophysical outcomes generated by the management of natural resources and the environment. I think Pak Andre, Afu, you talk more detail later on. And as the outcome generated by management natural resources and the environment, actually we can have at least three important things related to the environment. First, pollution control. If we can control the pollution, not just only air pollution, but maybe other pollution, yeah, one potential big source of fund for finance the development and environment. And secondly, in conservation. This is also very important. How we are dealing with conservation. How conservation can also benefit to the people, not just only conserve, but from the conservation program, we can have some benefit. I believe that all of you also often see the National Geographic program. There are many good, many interesting film provided by National Geographic all over the world related to the conservation. I think this is a good example. And then another important sectors that can be generated called amenities creation. How now people need amenities, not just only taking a photo and then upload it into Instagram. But this is people really need some more time for relax by enjoying a good environment. Yeah, I think this all my note that we will discuss together, Mbak Afu and Pak Andre. And I also, again, thank you very much for all speakers who contribute in this seminar, in this webinar. And I believe this discussion will be fruitful and productive. And yeah, officially I will open this webinar. So Department of Economic and Environmental Resource and Department of Resource Economic and Environmental will have a series of Green Talk. This is the first Green Talk series and will be followed by another series of Green Talk. Thank you very much. Bila taufiq. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Prof. Nunung, for your keynote speech. So we can have a background to before we start the real discussions. And then now we will start the discussion. But the moderator will be Pak Hari Priyadi. I will try to read his short curriculum vitae of Pak Hari Priyadi. Okay. Hari Priyadi is currently working as a World Bank technical advisor for the last 2 years, providing technical advice to the central and subnational government related with sustainable forest landscape. So he is focused on the forest landscape and climate change program in the bank. He is also senior associate of ESL Departemen of IPB University. He has been working with multidisciplinary projects for over 20 years with various institutions. Previously, he worked with Center for International Forestry Research as a researcher, and then also she worked previously in Swedish University of Agriculture Science (SLU) based in Alnarp, Sweden, as an assistant lecturer and researcher. And then he was working in Kahati Foundation as Environment and Social Safeguard Specialist for MCA Indonesian program, and also become a managing director with Departemen ESL, a consulting firm dealing with sustainable issues both for forestry and agricultural commodity. He was a conservation manager with Zoological Society of London, managing the project related with the wide range of landscape management, supporting low carbon development in South Sumatra. He holds forestry degree on forest management from IPB University, Master of Science in Tropical Resource Management from University Putra Malaysia, and with Swedish University of Agriculture Science for his PhD project. He attended various training related with natural resources management in University of Melbourne, Swedish University of Agriculture Science, University of Copenhagen, Proforest Oxford UK, University of Eastern Finland, University of Tartu, Estonia, Latvia University, and many more. He went to Florida University, USA, and Sierra France as a visiting researcher. He participated and delivered presentation in international and national seminar and meeting. He published more than 30 scientific articles or publications, including the peer-reviewed journals. With his team, he put foundation of Green Talk platform of ESL Departemen of IPB University. He loves traveling, cycling, and playing guitar. Okay, then Pak Hari, time is yours to moderate the Pak Apu and Pak Andre.
Okay, thank you to Pak Danang who kindly read my resume, and thanks to Pak Dekan, Professor Nuno, who has provided excellent guidance for the PES and also providing what you call a nice talk on a green talk in earlier what you call event. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the talk today. I saw some familiar colleagues here, so thank you for joining. And I hope you are in healthy and happy mood in the 19th day of Ramadan fasting. I think the bonus today is we will have a great knowledge from outstanding speakers while waiting for iftar. Inshallah, we will have a multiple pahala. Amin. Well, it is great honor for me to moderate first ever a Green Talk ESL IPB University. Actually, it is a department platform for communication, share knowledge, and experience of various issues dealing with wide range environment and economic topics. And thank you that today we have Pak Andre and Ibu Afu as outstanding speakers. So let me read their short resume. First, lady first. I will read Ibu Andita Fircelia Utami, or famously called Ibu Afu. She worked as an environmental economist of World Bank based in Jakarta. She holds a master in public policy from Harvard University, USA, with a concentration in international economic development, and a bachelor degree in international relations from University of Indonesia. Ibu Afu was co-founder Think Policy Society. It is an organization which aims to promote analytical mindset and cross-sectoral collaboration for a better policy making among young professionals in Indonesia. She also built an online community of young professionals working in the private sector, including over 7,000 social media followers on @Think Policy and website a member. So Ibu Afu is very she has a very outstanding experience in social media as well. And then second, I will read Pak Andre Aquino resume. Pak Andre is Senior Natural Resources Management Specialist at the World Bank, currently based in Jakarta, managing the Oceans and Landscape Program. He has over 18 years of international experience in natural resources management and environmental issues, including ocean, coastal management, and fisheries, as well as forestry, biodiversity, ecosystem services, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. He has managed several large-scale investment operations, led technical assistance to support government at national and subnational level, and conducted analytical work. This has included promoting payment for ecosystem services, promoting nature-based tourism investment, promoting public-private community partnership in different sectors, including RED+ at large scale, and promoting integrated landscape management. His experience spanned several countries in Africa: Angola, Botswana, Cameroon, DRC, Ethiopia, Ghana, Madagascar, Mozambique, Namibia, Republic of Congo, Republic of South Africa, and Latin America, Brazil, Costa Rica, Mexico, and also Asia, in this case, Indonesia. She holds a master's degree on environmental economics from the University of Maryland, USA. an executive program diploma in forestry from the University of Yale, USA, an environmental law postgraduate degree from the University of Para, Brazil, and bachelor degree from Catholic University of Minas Gerais, Brazil. Oh yeah, Pak Andre also loves singing and cycling. So he is Brazilian. Now, I would like to tell you, the audience, the rule of the session today. We will provide 30 minutes for both speakers to present the topics, and then we will continue with Q&A session. Those who want to ask or provide clarification, input, please write down in the comment line in the Google Meets. And I will read those questions to the speaker and they will respond it. I think that is fair enough, right? So without further ado, I would like to give the floor or the time to Pak Andre. Please, Pak Andre.
Okay. Terima kasih banyak, Pak Hari. I hope I can be heard well. So, selamat siang, teman-teman. It's really a great honor, and it's with deep happiness that I join you here to talk about a topic that is very close to my heart, the issue of payment for ecosystem services, a topic that in the region where I come from, Latin America, and particularly Brazil, as Bahari said, has been an important topic in, let's say, in the academia world, but also in practice. And I will share a little bit that with you, along with my colleague, Afu, who will come a bit after I share a little bit. Pak Nunung already mentioned the key role of ecosystem services for humanity. Payments for ecosystem services is a policy tool that basically try to increase ecosystem services. I think we don't need to spend time here on the fact that humanity has been losing ecosystem services at a very high speed, from biodiversity loss, the sixth mass extinction, some speak, to climate change and associated natural disasters. And now, and of course we cannot go, we can go to a BBL not on COVID, but we cannot not mention COVID. So I would even mention that the prevention of what we are calling the emerging diseases, right, such as emerging infectious diseases such as COVID, but also SARS, MERS, Ebola. We could, and some people have been studying this, even say that it's a disruption of ecosystem services, right? I mean, of particularly habitats or wildlife trade. But anyway, we don't need to go a lot there, just to say that ecosystem services are critical for the very existence. Now, what are payments for ecosystem services? If we can go to the next slide, it will show you basically a water treatment facility in my home country, Brazil. The goal of that facility is clear. You can see here in this small photograph in the bottom, how the water gets to the treatment facility on the left and how it leaves it. And this is a water treatment facility for domestic use. Now, the next picture will show you part of the larger landscape where this water is captured. So this is a typical rural property in this watershed. It's the watershed of the river Santa Maria. If we go to the next one, we see a different angle And here we start getting into the link between services and land use. So in this case here, the service that we're talking about is water quality, hydrological services. And there is a link between this landscape and that quality of water. So in this landscape here, you see that the upper side of this hill is still forested, whereas the lower side has been heavily degraded for pasture. It's a very common landscape in this part of Brazil. Now, we will talk later about the relation between this landscape and the quality of water. So what is our problem here? Let's take a little time on this graph here. What is our problem here? So the y-axis here shows you the volume of benefits to land users. Let's say how much money the land user, the landowner, makes. Okay, so the first column shows you deforestation and use for pasture. So you have a place that has forests. You clear that land and make it into pasture. Pasture for cattle, for meat, for you to sell meat. It's again a very common land use in my country. This is how much money you make. Okay, let's call this 100 reais, our currency. On the other side, you have conservation. So you see that the money, the benefit that the land user makes is smaller. Okay, now under these circumstances and not thinking about other variables, only economic rationality, what land use would the landowner normally adopt? Well, I mean, this is an empirical question, and as we can see in my country, they adopt pasture, right? So throughout the country, people are converting forests into pasture. Now, the same graph on deforestation still shows you the costs, the red part, the costs to downstream populations and to the globe. What are these costs? Well, these are the ecosystem services lost: water quality, carbon emissions, so climate change, and biodiversity, habitat loss. So by deforesting, this is what is being lost. And the next slide shows the idea of PES, of payment for ecosystem services. The idea is that part of, just before, still the earlier one, the idea here is that part of the costs, they are transformed into payments to the landholders, so that now the benefits that they get from conservation are larger than those from deforestation. Very important. The logic needs to be repeated every year. So the needs of annual payments, and for that you need sustained financing. This is the logic of payment for ecosystem services. Payments to change land use patterns. The next slide, we basically repeats this logic. So a PES is a mechanism, or let's call it a policy, a national policy, to improve the provision of ecosystem services. So to protect habitats, to reforest, to reintroduce species, particularly flora. Now, you that have studied economics, you know the principles of the user pays, right? So in pollution, this is very useful. So the idea here is that we apply the principle of user pay. Those that benefit from the ecosystem service, water quality, pay. And this payment goes to the provider. So provider gets, and the provider in this case are your land users. The payments are conditional. They come only and only if the service is provided, and the participation of providers and users is voluntary. They are doing this because it's in their interest to pay and to receive. Next. Very briefly, PES generated all this interest because in theory, important, let's keep this in mind, in theory, all I'm talking about here is a very theoretical. It could generate its own financing with the service users paying. It would be efficient because it's voluntary. Only those people that believe that the payments change the balance of their interest would come. It could be very sustainable. And one element that I would like to emphasize already here is that all this work is assuming that you can measure the services, right? You can measure that, and for that to happen, you need science, you need measurements, you need universities, you need knowledge. We're going to come back to this. Next. Yeah, this here is we can skip this one. It's basically a repetition. And then we move into concrete examples of Latin America. Here, it's just showing to you 4 countries, one of them is not in Latin America, that have been adopting payment for ecosystem services. So Costa Rica has been a front runner since 1997. And more or less now over 10%, and I think this has increased quite a lot, of the overall forests of the country are under some sort of payment for ecosystem service scheme. Mexico, it's a very large program because Mexico is a large country. Ecuador has a program. These are countries that have national level program. And on the graph here, you can see Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Brazil are also countries implementing PES. Some countries like Brazil, they don't have a national program. They have specific initiatives in some places and sometimes state level programs. So next one is about Mexico, and I will be concluding soon, handing over to Afu. The payment for ecosystem services in Mexico has its origin in in the realization basically of massive deforestation and water problems. It's very interesting to see that a lot of PES, they are born out of the realization of water hydrological problems, water quality or water quantity. We could discuss later why this. The program in Mexico pays for hydrological services and biodiversity, and it's funded by the federal government, by local mechanisms, local government, and international financing. If we move to the next slide, it shows you how quickly the program increased from 2003 to 17. These are millions of hectares of land under PES. So more or less now they have 2 million hectares. And in the last years, like starting 2014, they have a special one focused on REDD, R-E-D-D. Afu will talk about REDD later. The budget for this program is more or less $100 million a year. And the other graph just shows that the program is implemented throughout the country, but you can see that it's concentrated in a few areas because the program tries to aggregate, right? To aggregate those receiving the payments. Next is one quick slide on Costa Rica. This Costa Rica one here is nice. Is nice to show. On the left side, landowners, okay? So as we talked, they are the providers of the services. They adopt practices in managing the land that provides service: forest conservation, agroforestry, reforestation, natural regeneration. There are many others. They generate services: biodiversity conservation, carbon mitigation, hydrological service, scenic beauty. These are in the law of Costa Rica. They recognize these 4 services. Now, these services, they benefit society, national, international, and these are the payers. In the case of Costa Rica, this is paid through a fuel tax, water tariffs, international donors, and not only donors, but international sources, private sector, and carbon buyers. The money all goes into a national fund called FONAFIFO. FONAFIFO is an institution that manages the payments. So FONAFIFO receives the money, channels the money back to the landowners. So that's how it is working in the case of Costa Rica. To conclude on international experiences, very briefly, has it worked? Has PES worked? I will not spend a lot of time here. We can talk about this later. So the answer is not very straightforward. It has worked in maintaining forest cover, and particularly in promoting reforestation. But many people have questions about additionality. The question here is, have they conserved the land that would otherwise have been deforested? So basically, are we paying for lands that maybe they would be conserved in any case? So we can talk about that a lot. There's a lot of research on this. In socioeconomic, and Pa Nunung talked about this, the impact on poverty. Yes, there has been some impact on poverty, but one very important thing here in the case of Costa Rica and Mexico is that only properties that have land rights and certificates are eligible. This makes it that often those that are paid are not the poorest, right? So there has been some transfer of income, but not as great as was expected at the beginning. And it has improved later, and we can talk about how that happened. Let me stop here and again move to my colleague Afu. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me clearly. Pahari, I was wondering if I can share my screen, but if that's not possible, that's fine as well. All right. Thank you very much. So thank you, Andre, for that very comprehensive explanation. I think I'll begin by sharing as well that I think when we developed the content for this presentation, we're focusing on basically the main principles, the primary idea, the very concept of it. So it might not be designed for an advanced audience who might be among the audience right now. So just to provide kind of a brief summary of what has already been explained, I will focus more on providing examples at the national level, focusing on the story of RAD-based payments in East Kalimantan and perhaps Jambi. But before that, I just want to mention quickly, just as a refresher on what we've already heard from Andre, in terms of the key elements of a PES, the keywords that we have been introduced with. So one, usually in a PES scheme, there is a clear ecosystem services that is being procured. In this case, usually it's either a water provision from a watershed, usually in an upstream river if it's water, and it can also be carbon emissions reduction or other types of ecosystem services. But there's usually a clear defined service being discussed. And secondly, there is the incentives. This is basically the payments, and here there is usually a clear seller and buyer of the services. So what is the how much is the payments, who's paying, and all of that is part of this kind of like the incentive element. Thirdly, you'll have a behavior that you've targeted for the intervention. So would you like the seller basically to restore or to conserve or to kind of change their behavior in a certain way through using PES as an instrument? And lastly, and this is really important, is the distribution of those payments, which usually involves multiple stakeholders. And this is linked to the discussion on equity and the broader distribution. So again, this is kind of just a fun way to illustrate what that looks like. So usually there in the upstream river, there is forest with a clear ecosystem services that the PES scheme would like to focus on. There's the behavior that the PES scheme would like to incentivize on, either to conserve or restore. There's the upstream community, in this case, usually the farmers or the local communities living in the upstream of a river, if the service is of course, water provision. And also there's the downstream water users, and there's the compensation and distribution among the upstream community. So hopefully this is clear as a concept. Yeah. So I'd like to start by saying that typically a PES scheme, like a pure PES scheme, is being implemented at the local level with the scheme that we just saw in the previous slide. I'd like to highlight two examples, which, if I'm not mistaken, the students from IPB have been assigned to read and watch documentary videos on. One is the Rinjani forest in Lombok, and second is the Cidanau watershed in Banten. So for in the Rinjani forest, basically the scheme is quite, I think across PES implementation, the scheme is usually similar, where you will have a buyer. In this case, and in Rinjani, it's actually quite interesting because they went through 3 phases of PES scheme. Initially, they developed the PES scheme as kind of quite basic in a form of voluntary payment through an intermediary institution or organization, the Bestari Community Fund, which also received additional support, in this case from international organization. However, as they started to implement, this was in early 2000, and then they started to implement the scheme and obtain some more lessons learned from the implementation. They've developed the scheme a bit broader, and this is particularly interesting because basically they've incorporated the operational costs for managing the Rinjani forest into the PDAM water bill across 3 different districts. So this is very interesting because it's integrated directly to the water bill being paid by the users in the downstream river. So the people who benefit directly from the provision of water in the downstream level. So this is one example of implementation in Rinjani forest. The other example, and this was, I think the latest information I get is from 2012, is the implementation in Cidanau watershed, where basically this was a bit different. If in the previous scheme, the bill was integrated, or the payment scheme was integrated into the PDAM water bill. In the case of Cidanau watershed, the main buyer at the time was KTI, or the Krakatau Tirta industry. This is basically an industry that's using the water provision for their own generation of economic value. And what's interesting that we can see here comparing the 2 schemes is that PES schemes are very flexible. It can be adopted in different ways with different approaches, depending on the context of the local communities, depending on who the actors are and the stakeholders. But typically, similar to the case in Latin America that Pa Andre shared earlier, there's usually an intermediary facility or body that manages the fund and allocate the funds and distribute the payments basically across the different stakeholders or activities. So this is just a table summarizing existing or ongoing PES schemes being implemented in Indonesia. As you can see here, there are many examples that are more localized, that are usually water-based PES. So we talked about the Cidanau example, there's the Mount Rinjani example, there's also in Aceh, there's an Aceh payments for watershed services being implemented. You can see all the details in this table. In Lampung, there's a similar scheme being implemented. But what I would like to talk about more from the World Bank experience is a PES scheme that's more carbon-based, and in particular are the activities that we're working on in East Kalimantan and Jambi. But this is just, so I highlighted this two last part just to show that you know, international donors have been involved in this other activities as well. And in this case, the PES scheme focuses on carbon as the ecosystem service. If you remember how we need to define the ecosystem service first in the beginning. So we've talked about the concept of PES, and now we'd like to talk about how basically the RED Plus scheme is a form, you can say it's a form, an adoption of a PES scheme that is more multi-level. So if you saw from the local examples that we already discussed in Rinjani and Cidanau, for example, the stakeholders are usually quite localized. There's an upstream community, there's the downstream community, and there's the seller and buyer. But RED Plus scheme in particular is quite interesting because basically Indonesia's forests provide really important and critical service in terms of carbon emissions reduction to the international community, to the world. And as such, so the same approach or the same thinking in a PES scheme where you provide, you know, certain services and you receive payments from it is kind of applies as well in what we now know as the RED Plus scheme. So basically here, what happens in a RED Plus scheme is you have the buyers at the international level. This includes development agencies, development donor organizations, and sometimes it can also be private sector market. So these are companies that have emissions reduction targets, either by the country, the regulation in their own country, and so on, and also other types of global funds, including GEF and so on. So in this case, you know, because it's an international level institutions, the first seller, we can say, is at the national level, which is the national level government. Typically, there's like a national RED fund agency being established. In the case of Indonesia, in late 2019, we know that the Indonesian government has just launched the Environment Fund Facility, or we call it as BPDLH. So BPDLH is kind of like the national level buyer in a way. But at the same time, it's also a seller, in the international scheme, they're a seller, but also at the same time, they're buyer in terms of actually working with subnational level actors or stakeholders whose behavior we are trying to kind of promote or encourage through a RED scheme. In this case, it's avoided deforestation, avoided illegal logging, conservation activities. The activities can really range quite widely. But this is just to show that it's interesting how, like in a RED Plus scheme, the approach is like a multi-level PES scheme where you have different actors at different levels. One particular thing I would like to highlight here is how maybe a bit different from a localized PES scheme where the payment is quite straightforward, where you have clear service, you have a clear way to measure the service, through, number of, for example, restored forest or water provision at the downstream level and so on. In a reduced deforestation scheme, the measurement and the monitoring part can be a bit tricky because basically, usually you have to establish business as usual first in order to measure an avoided deforestation. But that's something more to be discussed later. And so in a PES, both in, I think, red and in general, I think it's important to think about these three different things, which might sometimes be, as a trade-off to one another. But this is just to say that, first, there needs to be, we need to consider about the effectiveness of the PES scheme, how it will actually affect the outcomes, but also think about how to do the intervention in the most efficient way, so how to minimize the cost. And lastly, and I think this is particularly interestingly important for Indonesia, because which is the equity part of the scheme, right? How do we distribute the payments? How would that affect poverty level in the area being intervened and so on? I'll try to be a bit quicker because I realize I'm probably running out of time. But so just to provide one example that the World Bank working on is Kalimantan through Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, basically, or FCPF. This is a scheme where this is a results-based scheme where we provide the incentives through the funds for the local government, for the subnational, or for the jurisdiction, and I'll talk more about that later, where we would like to encourage certain behavior to protect the forest in East Kalimantan. So we begin, of course, like we need to identify the problem first. And in this case, in the past decade between 2006 and 2016, there was a lot of deforestation happening due to expansion of oil palm areas, timber plantations, mining, and so on. And so this FCPF program in East Kalimantan is expected to reduce at the gross level around 86 million tons of carbon dioxide, which can also be linked to Indonesia's own emissions reduction goal. And the way to do that, and this is a bit, I think, broader than a typical localized PES scheme, where you probably have a specific activity that's quite defined or confined. With deforestation, it very much linked to the broader land governance as well. So in this activity, we also try to address the underlying landscape governance, the underlying governance issues, including through policy reforms and engaging the companies in East Kalimantan and local communities there in a way that promote or reduce deforestation rate. And lastly, just to discuss, so because in this case, the stakeholders are quite wide-ranging, it's quite, it involves many stakeholders, then the aspect of payment distribution becomes really important as well. First, you have the different levels of government in here, including the national government, the provincial government, the district government, and so on. And then there's the private sector companies who has, for example, concessions with remaining forests and so on. There's the local communities and so on. And there's also an important role of the environment fund facility that I mentioned, or BPDLH, in this distribution process. So these are kind of like just some thinking or like issues that are worth highlighting to be further discussed. So yeah, as I said, this is just example. For example, in terms of distribution of payments, yes, there's the incentives. In this case, results-based payments that's being allocated. But how do you distribute across the different actors? That's kind of like an issue that would require further discussion. How much of it would be allocated for operational costs across the different levels of government? And how much would be based on actual performance across the different actors as well, as you can see. So this is just to kind of stimulate further discussion on this. And lastly, and this is even also more important is the measurement, monitoring, and reporting. And this is important across all types of RED projects, where you need to have a frequently updated data, data that is transparent and accessible to the public in order to have a robust approach or robust methodology to measure the results itself, because the payment will be, part of the payments will be based on results. So how do you measure those results in an accountable way? So final reflections, I think. So first question is, so can PES be scaled up in Indonesia? Yes, it definitely can be. It has been implemented across the country, both for water-based and for carbon-based. But defining the seller, the buyer, and for what service becomes critical, including what we talked about in terms of payment distribution and measurement and monitoring methodologies. And don't forget that in any PES scheme, it usually takes a lot of time to develop not only the scheme, but also the trust across the stakeholders. So that's also a process that's usually very time-intensive and energy-intensive. And it's important to think about, thinking about national scheme versus local schemes and how, what are the different trade-offs in those options. There's also a need to generate further demand. So in the international market, for example, in the domestic market, how do we create maybe carbon market or like an emissions trading system that will generate higher willingness to pay, so that payments for so that restoration or conservation activities can be as competitive, if not more, than palm oil plantations, for example. So this would generate a clear incentive for people to opt for conservation compared to other types of land use, which might require deforestation or land opening. And finally, and this is also important, is the PES is not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's only one out of many, many other economic instruments that can be used to promote conservation. We know that there is there's always other fiscal instruments that can be used through tax, transfers from the national government to subnational government and so on. There's also a broader kind of conservation scheme that can be approached, different projects, different activities. So need to think about PES in terms of its cost effectiveness vis-a-vis these other options. And this is particularly important for Indonesia. Usually PES schemes are effective in areas with clear land tenure, where there's a clear ownership of the land. So when you provide or procure the services, there's clear ownership of like who owns that land and what kind of activities, who has the authority to manage or to do certain activities of that area. But in the case of Indonesia, as you might be or might not be aware of, land tenure is also something that the government is still working on to have more clarity on. So I think we've talked about most of this. And lastly, I think this final slide, just in terms of looking ahead, what to think about. Right now, there's already a global recognition on the importance of Indonesia's forest. It's already been acknowledged, through different financing facilities and in the global discussion, how important the role of Indonesia's forest is. And the newly established BPDLH as the agency that can procure even more PES schemes across the country. There's opportunity from RED Plus payments from Norway through this different FCPF, BioCF schemes, and also voluntary markets. And also not to mention that there's already existing programs that can be leveraged to distribute payments. The jurisdictional programs in Jambi and East Kalimantan. We can also talk about ecological fiscal transfers that the government has been kind of working on and has been implemented in some districts. There's also Village Fund, and this was actually my master's thesis as well, how to leverage village funds to improve sustainability outcomes, for example, in addition to economic development outcomes. And yeah, how can this be linked to PES scheme, for example, in many, many areas in Indonesia? So I think with that, these are Andre and my contact, should you have any further questions. And I would like to give the floor back to Pak Hari. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibu Afu and Pak Andre for the presentation. I think that is fantastic and super informative. So now we have a question and answer session, but I can see there are a lot of what you call question and also share knowledge from the participant. So let me choose the what you call the input from Pak Putra pertama. Pak Putra is the former Director General at KLHK. Now is busy with the as a Ketua Harian of Forum Nasional DAS or upstream organizations. So he's sharing knowledge that the PES is a very nice concept, but why is it not widely adopted? We are fed up with some example of implementation years after years. For example, Cidanau in Indonesia and globally in Costa Rica. When a nice concept remaining mostly concept, there must be something not quite working. So this is question maybe to Pak Andre, who can respond. What is the challenges actually in terms of PES implementation? So I would like to give Pak Andre respond to this what you call share information from Pak Putra. Please, Pak Andre.
Okay, Pak Hari. Terima kasih, Pak Putra. I was reading the questions, and when I read that, I was giggling, because it's a question I ask myself too. Okay, I myself am a big believer in economic instruments, and this addresses, I think, another question we had there. One of the speakers asked, but how do we deal with the fact that the environment comes second in a country like Indonesia? I would say not Indonesia, everywhere in my country for sure. It's the case as well, and many other, including in the industrialized world, right? I think the idea of PES was exactly this, that it's based on self-interest. You are profiting more from conserving than from doing something else. So you're not conserving or adopting the practices because government told you to do so, which is command and control, or because you are ashamed of something, but because it's good for you. And I think this now allows me to talk about to Pak Putra and why it hasn't happened. I mean, I believe for two reasons. One, is the money there? Is the money there? I agree with you. I mean, every time we talk PES, Costa Rica. Well, I mean, to be fair, Mexico too. And actually, I could even say that the number of PES schemes have increased in the world, but not as much as one would have expected, right? Because in the 90s, in the beginning of the 2000s, this was really the solution. So again, why not? I believe two things. Who is paying? Who is paying? Now, on the who is paying, I think there are two issues. One is now we have all these new things with red carbon payments, right? So there is, I think for the first time, some willingness to pay internationally. Now, is this perfect? By no means. By no means. The World Bank, we ourselves, I mean, before Indonesia was working for the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. It's one of these big funds to pay for carbon. It has $1.6 billion now. If the countries were reducing deforestation at a fast rate, that money would be gone in 1 year, and we wouldn't have more money. Now, I think this is one of the problems, right? So the willingness to pay may or may not be there. So I think that's a very important topic to discuss, and particularly now speaking more as a Brazilian, a topic of discussion, like, okay, who is benefiting from these services? Who is willing to pay for them? I do believe here, particularly for the global services, climate change, and also biodiversity. Biodiversity is the most complicated one, in my opinion. We would need to think about international transfers. I think we will need to talk about international transfers. Now, back to the local ones, and I will not talk about Indonesia at all. I mean, Cidanau, that's new to me, so I'm all very excited to learn about these things, that Rinjani. But it seems that, yes, I was also looking at that and asking myself, well, this has been going on for 20 years. Why only this one thing in Banten? Why we don't have this in Jawa Timur, Jawa Barat, Sulawesi, di mana-mana? I think here there is one thing. I mean, the water services, one thing I've noticed in Latin America is that the companies, they have reservations on the science, whether really managing upstream forests and riparian forests will lead to the results they want. So I think here, there is an element of scientific data that needs to be improved. And then to conclude, sorry, because this is really, I think, the very important point. There's also something else, and this is complicated. I don't know how to solve. Often, there are other factors beyond the control of the land user that affects the provision of ecosystem services. So I remember very well when I was working in this one project in Brazil, in a state in southeast Brazil. I remember once we went to the field, we were talking to the farmers, and they were saying something like, yeah, of course. I mean, now we have been reforesting the riparian forest. We don't plant in 10 meters along the rivers. But you know what? They are building a road there, and they are not doing a great job. I mean, that road is generating all this erosion into the water. And I'm like, well, yeah, right. So if we are paying the PES here, but the water users downstream, including the company, may still be getting bad water. So complicated issues, right? So I think this explains the things. Willingness to pay might not be there. And sometimes the one-to-one relation between land use and service is not there. Bahari, back to you.
Thank you, Pak Andre. That is very nice response, and based on your experience, and I believe that you have been working with the PES and also RED-related issue. That is really useful learning from PES implementation. So I will see again some of the questions. That is I saw from Pak Irfan. This is interesting too. Let me check. Pak Irfan. So he has questions. How is the strategy to increase people interest dealing with pests surrounding the area? And another question is dealing with how to inform local community in order to really interest and involve with the PES scheme, PES activities. Perhaps Ibu Afu could share experience from Lombok story that you presenting, Ibu Afu, please.
Yeah. So I think in terms of how PES schemes started, right? I think, and I haven't actually been involved directly in a PES implementation, but just based on the literatures that I read, usually there is a clear, unfortunately, usually start with a damaged source of water first. So the downstream communities finally realize the importance of the upstream forests or the conservation activities at the upstream level to their supply of water. And usually this, in some of these cases, including the international examples, it happens a bit late in the process when they realize the importance of ecosystem services. But once that's there, usually either the private, either it's a company in downstream or the government at the downstream level, or a consortium of NGOs or any other, usually like green NGOs, I think, will start developing or talking to the upstream communities and trying to develop a PES scheme. So I think this relates to the previous question, and why isn't this a bit more widely adapted? It's because maybe to some extent people don't realize the importance of these natural assets in providing the key ecosystem services, and we take our water supply for granted, and the market for carbon, for example, is not quite as developed at the competitiveness level that is required for the price to be competitive enough with other alternative uses. So I think that would be how I hopefully I answered the question. And there's one question as well on the comment section on how this could also benefit indigenous communities. And I think so. This is really important part of why maybe PES is not quite widely accepted in Indonesia as well, which is the issue of land tenure and land rights. Again, because in other countries, I think to some extent there's clear private ownership of the land area at the upstream level, where you know who the sellers are, and you start developing voluntary agreements with those sellers. But in areas where the rights over, for example, forest areas are in Indonesia, it's under Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And in some areas, there's management rights being provided to certain communities or adat communities and so on. So without a clarity over the rights and tenurial rights of those areas, sometimes it's a bit difficult to set up a PES scheme where you have more clarity on who the sellers and who the buyers are. So I think, yeah, across this different issues, awareness, clarity on land tenure, and also market readiness, there's a lot more that we can do. Back to you, Pak Hari.
Thank you, Bu Afu. That is very super informative. And I think in relation with the community, there is question raised by Alma Gawe. How to incorporate how to incorporate dana desa into PES. This is very interesting. Maybe you or maybe Pak Andre could respond it. And another thing is how to address lack of participation from both service user and service provider to engage with the PES implementation. So I think those two question from the participant that may you may respond. Please, Pak Andre or Ibu Afu. Pak Andre, maybe.
Okay, I can start. Bu Afu, she just mentioned that she has studied this in her master. I confess that I've been in Indonesia now for less than a year, but that one of the things that caught my attention the first was exactly dana desa and its potential for creating incentives for ecosystem services, right, at the very local level. So we have been looking at this a lot these days and discussing internally at the World Bank, sometimes discussing with the government, including with Kemendesa. So we are working with our colleagues from that collaborate with Ministry of Villages and Ministry of Dalam Negeri on the implementation of dana desa. Anyway, my point is that I feel there is a lot of potential, if we could imagine additional funds being allocated to dana desa based on performance in terms of some of natural resources management, I think we could see very important results. I will not, I would just mention that I've heard, but I haven't really read with a lot of details, but I've heard that programs that have worked at the village level, such as, Desa Peduli Gambut, Desa Peduli Api, not Peduli Api, something like, anyway, to prevent fire, have shown to have good results. Let me just generate one problem here. I mentioned one problem, and this is something that another colleague mentioned: local circumstances. One thing that is very important to look at, particularly at the very local level, is how village masyarakat, they respond to incentives, right? So not everybody responds to incentives, monetary incentives in the same way, right? And I think it's very important to understand this. So how would the Kepala Desa react to certain incentives, whether it is additional allocation from Dana Desa, but maybe he would react even better to recognition if his Desa is considered the Kabupaten #1 firefighter. I don't know. This is a very national specific thing. And we could talk about this because another experience I have is in the Amazon, in the state of Amazonas, which is the biggest state in Brazil, where we have worked with communities exactly in that. So, but this will be for a next opportunity. Let me turn to Afu Pro.
Thank you, Pak Andre. Bu Afu, please.
Yes, thank you, Pak Andre and Pak Hari. I think, so the key word here, which Andre already mentioned, is personal interest, right? And the way that Dana Desa has been designed is basically to provide more autonomy and resources and empowerment to each of the villages to use this money for services, for activities that actually benefit the village communities directly, right? So they in principle, they have the village communities have authority over how they want to spend their village fund, and this was also like a key part of the analysis that I did. So the thing here is, how do we then raise the awareness of the village communities of the not just awareness, but how do the village communities acknowledge that there are certain natural assets that are important, that are critical in providing certain ecosystem services for their community? So how do you show that it's within their interest to allocate some of these finances to fund or to finance restoration or conservation type activities, right? So one is, which doesn't have to be done through a PES scheme, but basically in a very localized way, how do village administrative units allocate some of the village fund resources to do conservation or restoration activities, so within the village themselves. But another scheme is, for example, downstream villages that have benefited from, we know that, around 18,000 or 25,000, between 18 and 25,000 of villages are in forest areas, but there are also other forest areas that probably are at like the downstream level and actually benefits from water supply from an upstream village, for example. So how do the downstream villages, for example, allocate some of their village fund to help support the upstream villages in restoration or conservation type of activities? But again, in order to get to this point, to some extent, the village communities need to also realize and acknowledge the importance of these natural assets, which is a critical part. And to some extent, even in Jakarta, right, we take our water supply for granted. We don't know where it's coming from. In areas where the PDAM services is good, So it depends on like how the different situations in different areas, how they view, how critical is water supply services for that area and so on. But the key word here is that we shouldn't, we can promote PES as a way to help people realize the importance of these natural assets, such that it's in their own self-interest to actually spend or come up with PES schemes, but not to kind of like force villages to spend their village fund in a certain way, because that's not the goal in the design of the village fund itself. So hopefully that provides some additional insights as well, Pak Hari.
Thank you so much, Ibu Afu. That is very super response. I have a very interesting question raised by student, IPB student here, Ibu Afu. Maybe you can respond it. How the student can be involved in the PES implementations. So maybe you have some idea, or using your network on social media, so you may involve the student into the implementation. So please, Ibu Afu.
Yeah, one key thing I think is, really utilize your time in the university to become smarter, or like the smartest version of yourself. So if you're interested in the PES scheme, use this very valuable time to read more, to understand better how it's being implemented in different places, and understand what are the key challenges. Maybe, you know, join, if I know that there is KKN, is it still called KKN now? But maybe there are some KKN activities that can be linked to some type of like PES type activities or conservation activities and so on. And secondly, you know, the same way that I used my thesis or skripsi for undergrad, right? How do you can use your skripsi as a way to address maybe some of the key policy challenges or implementation challenges of PES, you know, maybe answering the question, the exact question of why aren't there more PES schemes being implemented in Indonesia, and what are your recommendations for that? So kind of use your academic resources, the time, the skripsi, all these different instruments to help answer this question. But more importantly, perhaps after you graduate, you know, you can think about the I don't know, maybe joining either like a development sector type jobs or other types of activities where you can help promote and implement PES schemes in your respective areas of interest, and so on. So I think these are just several ways that you can think about it. Of course, beyond this kind of more professional type journey, you can always, you know, raise more awareness, talk about PES using your social media, you know, talk to your friends, talk to different people that you know about this scheme. But I think it's even more important to actually invest time in the research and in the implementation process, which I think you can really use with all this time in your hands. I kind of miss, I'm kind of churcholing a bit because I really miss the time when I'm just a student and, you know, have the privilege to read a bunch of literatures and write. So really utilize that, I think.
Thank you so much, Ibu Apul. That is very, important response, I think, for the student. So I have interesting question again, Pa Andre. So this is question about how to get carbon credit in the international market. I mean, the best way to get international buyer for carbon credit. That is question raised by Nitanan Kosi. Pak Andre, you may share your experience.
Okay, Pak. Yeah, that's a webinar in its own. Let me try to be super brief. I'm just trying to find a way here to summarize. So the carbon markets, I mean, okay, first, not all payment to carbon is market payment, right? So there are payments for carbon not coming from the carbon market. For instance, we mentioned this program in Kalimantan, Timur. The payments would come from the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, or in Jambi, from the Biocarbon Fund. These are funds with money from the international community, from donors. And they are paying for carbon, they are paying for results, but they are not generating carbon offsets. I think that's the big difference, right? So it's not a carbon market. So there are several initiatives internationally to pay tropical countries for reduced deforestation. The most important one in Indonesia, I mean, one of the most important one in Indonesia is the bilateral agreement between Indonesia and Norway, right? Whereby Norway made a commitment to pay up to a certain amount if there are results. And it's very exciting that right now the KLHK, Ministry of Finance, Coordinator of Perekonomian, they are working together and have established the BPDLH. So the BPDLH as the instrument to receive these funds and allocate the funds from carbon. So I think Indonesia has a lot of potential. There are already a lot of commitments for carbon payments to Indonesia. And I think that if Indonesia is able to receive these payments and use them well, there would be significant interest in providing more. Let me just conclude, because I will need to leave in a few minutes. There was several people asked about institutions. I think this is a key issue, a very key issue. Costa Rica and Mexico, they have been successful in doing what they are doing. In Brazil, much less successful at the national level, because they had strong institutions that could manage this. In the case of Costa Rica, this is FONAFIFO. So FONAFIFO is a fund managed with very robust fiduciary rules that receives the payments from fuel tax, from water tariffs, and then allocates the payments. This institution has been very important. So I think having national institutions that manage the funding, that uses science in the right way, is key. So I think that's an important lesson, I would say, that may be of use to Indonesia. And once again, carbon payments is a way, not always from markets, but there is significant potential. Yeah, Pak Hari?
Fantastic, Pak Andre. Thank you so much. That is a very important point. So, people, we have now 3:27 p.m. So we have to conclude the presentation and also question and answer. I know that there are several questions still remaining there, but I'm sure Pak Andre and Ibu Afu agree to share the PowerPoint presentation to the audience, right? So then if you guys have some of the clarification or the question, so you may reach out the speakers. And let me, conclude Green Talk today and with the take-home message. Payment for environmental services is based on voluntary incentive, either from government or bilateral agreement. There is a need to identify what behavior is targeted for intervention. For example, reducing deforestation and encroachment. Benefit sharing PES could help redistribute wealth and benefit for local communities living near the critical natural asset. As mentioned by both speakers, there are many PES implementation on the ground at national and also international level. Pak Andre provided example of World Bank program in Latin America, and Ibu Afu share example from Indonesia. Not one size fits for all solution, so it needs to be used alongside other policy. By that, I conclude the presentation today. So I will give back to Pak Danang to lead the next session. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Pak Hari, Pak Andre, and Mbak Andita for such an amazing and interesting presentation. I think many people has an insight to learn more about the PES. And then in the last session, there will be a closing statement from our head of department. So for the Pak Ahyar, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pak Danang. Very interesting, Pak Hari. My Excellency, for our Dean, Professor Dr. Nunung Nuriartono, My Excellency, our two speakers, Pak Andre Aquino and Ibu Afu, Ibu Afu, Andita Firtuli Utami. My Excellency, our moderator, Pak Hari Priyadi. My Excellency, Dr. Metia Kayani is the Secretary of the ESL Department, and my respectable for our all audiences. First of all, as the head of the ESL Department, would like to thank Professor Nunung Nuriartono as Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management, IPB University, and also as the keynote speaker for this activity. thanks all to the two extraordinary speakers, of course, from the World Bank, Pak Ande Aquina and Ibu Andita. Terima kasih, Bu. And to the moderator, Pak Hari Priyadi and Dr. Meti Ekani as the person in charge of the course and the entire committee for the implementation of this lecture. All participants who joined today, more or less 200%, consist lecturer and student from domestic and international participants such as UPM, UPLB, Ho Chi Minh, Segi University, Tokyo University, Acara University, and from domestic, from STAN, Pertama University, Universitas Indonesia, Gajah Mada University, Erlangga, and others. As we know, Indonesia has suffered critical forest loss and other environmental degradation due to agricultural expansion and uncontrolled economic development. Conservation of vital habitats is more likely if forest owner and forest dwelling communities can be compensated with the true economic value of the ecosystem services provided, including protection of water quality, prevention of runoff, harvest of natural forest product, and the aesthetic of the attractiveness of natural landscapes that are important for tourism. This is the first activity of the planned Green Talk platform in the ESL department. And we are very happy for the implementation of this activity and hope that IPB University could seek potential collaboration with the World Bank. Finally, I'm sure all participants could gain knowledge from the two speakers above who have shared with us the concept, implementation, and challenges of PES in several countries, especially in the forestry sector. Thank you so much to all communities, Pak Danang and team, who have worked hard to prepare this activity. The last, I would like to say thanks to all participants who joined at this activity. I do apologize if there are many mistakes. Thank you.
Okay. I have this
certificate. Before the event end, let me give you certificate of speaker for Green Talk today. First for, I'm sorry, for Pak Andre.
Andre.
I give you a certificate, Pak Andre. Okay, Pak Andre. Next.
Pak Ahyar.
Ya.
Pak Ahyar, saya sampaikan Pak Andre ada interview di luar, jadi mohon maaf tadi harus leave gitu ya, harus keluar gitu, mohon maaf.
Oke.
Ya.
Next for Bu Apu.
Yeah, thank you, Pak.
Yeah. And next for moderator.
Terima kasih Pak Ahyar.
Sama-sama Pak Hari, terima kasih juga Departemen. And the last maybe Pak Nunung. Okay, thank you very much, Pak Danang.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ahir, and thank you for all participants. And then the last, there is perhaps a speech from the Bu Meti, like as a coordinator of the forestry economic. Bu Meti, there is Bu Meti. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Danang. Thank you so much for Pak Andre, but already leave ya. And Ibu Fau, Ibu Anitia, terima kasih Bu. So thank you for the nice and excellent sharing for our student. Yeah, hopefully it can enrich knowledge of our student, and Bu Afu already inspired my student for some some research for the final result. Hopefully, so my student, I do hope to wait for your result in PES. Perhaps Pak Andre and Ibu Afu can help my student later. Okay. And also thank you for all the participants to join this meeting. And thank you Pak Hari for connect us to Pak Andre and Ibu Afu. And also thank you for Pak Nunung and Pak Ahyal, and Pak Danang, Pak Bu Asti, my colleagues in Forest Economic Lecture. Hopefully, this Green Talk is the first one, ya Pak Hari ya.
Yeah.
So we will have the next event in Green Talk. Hopefully, all of the participants, you can also join with our next event. We can talk about everything about green, right, Pak Hari?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I think that's all for me. Thank you very much, and I'm very enjoy this meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bu Meti. And then I do apologize for the some of technical issue in this first of the Green Talk, especially in the YouTube platform, because there is so low bad signal here. So there is very bad in the YouTube. There is no sound, and there's the picture is keep buffering, so it will be evaluated to us to make a good presentation in the next session, and also the live streaming. And then sure, thank you for the all participant and the material, like the Pahari said, and then the speaker want to share, so I just put the link to the PDF of the material in the comment room, so you can check the link. Hopefully it will be help you to learn deeper about the PES, and also I will be put some of the other material from the Bu Afu, like a journal and then video. So I think that's enough. Thank you for all the participants, and then also all the invited speaker, and then Pak Hari also as a moderator. Hopefully we can do it better in the future, and then hopefully the speaker also can give an insight to all the participants. Thank you. Good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Terima kasih banyak. Thank you.